we have to understand, and it makes perfect sense. Nobody wants to get a shift of balance if they're on the winning side. So we also have to understand that alternative gender practices and imagined futures during conflict did change some of the ways people saw the world. And that becomes a kind of reservoir. I mean, how do we know this? In fact, Bridget, maybe you know this. During World War II, Rosie the Riveter in North America, women poured into jobs, had money, had jobs, had self-respect. Afterwards, they immediately went back into the home. But then in the 60s, their daughters started raising Cain, including me, and thinking of a different world. So we need to think about, was there any way that those dreams from the conflict days somehow percolated into the minds and consciousness and surface at another day? I think that's something we have to, just because different ways of doing things don't triumph in the short run doesn't mean they don't have a potential impact. This is something I've just started thinking about it. This is the first time I've presented this paper, so it's taken me a month to be able to even look at it. I just couldn't even look at it, so it's exciting to get back to it. But the mechanisms for constraining change and asserting patriarchal power are very complicated, and we've talked about a number of them. We've talked about the way in which the retaining of gender hierarchies by feminizing certain population of the male rulers. The removing gender from a discussions, so allowing women and men to behave in new ways, but making it not about gender. Then there's the work by a number of people points to the way in which the women who tried to bend gender the most are the ones that actually got hit the hardest. And some of the authors that I've mentioned have pointed out that it's the women that really pushed to be the most assertive that got the most pushback. That they're the ones that were labeled troublemakers, weird, problems, etc. And so there are processes that have disciplined women back into different ways of looking at the world. But what I've added on, and I'm going to try to imagine and write about a little bit more extensively, is that, you know, do we need, I'll put it, I'm not even going to say it as a question. I think we need to think maybe more long range and think about what are the possibilities that, and there was one other strategy which I didn't mention, which is very important, which is creating this notion of the exception. That's like the notion of the duration, the notion that, yes, they're women warriors and they're fantastic, like the Russian women snipers, who were killed more than any other group of snipers in the entire Russian forces. But they were all seen as exceptions, not women, but like ungendered people. But the question that I'm leaving you with is, are there ways that some of those experiences, even if they get sidelined in the short term and don't seem to be carrying the day in the post-conflict transformation, is it possible that they can lurk there as a kind of undiffused bomb almost, you know, hidden in the ground, as a way that could possibly lead to future ways of thinking, alliances and challenges that would help to push us towards a more gender equal world. So this paper, as it was written, was a little more pessimistic. Now I think I need to leave us at least with some thoughts about possibilities that change can come. It just may not come at the speed or in the way that you'd like it to. So thanks for being my first audience. I think
Thanks, Jane, for the presentation. I think it's a sort of cutting edge kind of research, because a lot of work is not being done on the issue of rethinking gender in the context of conflict. particularly post-conflict situations. And I've done a lot of work on post-conflict situations, as you know, right? In Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Angola. And they want to raise Angola because they think Angola is your outlier case. It's a case that would go against some of the things that you just mentioned, in the sense that the women who fought in the war in Angola, once they experienced the liberation of being part of the military effort, UNITA, they came back and could never fit into society in a normal patriarchal way, and therefore they forced the government then to make changes.
Really? So they didn't get sidelined?
They didn't get sidelined.
Because in Mozambique they got completely trounced.
Yeah. So I think Angola might be the test case here to see whether or not there are, and to understand whether or not there are ways in which you can actually change the narrative of the government once the wars are finished. That would allow women a much more important role in the society, as I think many of the Angolan women who fought in that war did manage to achieve. So I was trying to call it up just now on my phone because
I need some sources from you in English.
I thought would be useful. And this one is by Henda Lucados. It was published in 2004. But it looked at the military peace to social justice, was titled From Military Peace to Social Justice, the Angolan Peace Process, and it really looked at women's experiences within the Angolan conflict, not just as victims, but as soldiers, as leaders, activists, and that part is really poorly understood, as the person said, and she was trying to sort of show that the experience of the Angolan women quite different from the other women in other conflicts across Africa. So that might be a nice case to add to your book.
Yeah. I think it is a book. I think it may be an edited collection that really requires chapters with people who have in-depth knowledge of these different cases. But I mean, like in Zimbabwe, I was living and doing my research for my PhD in Zambia in 75-6. And in 75, Mozambique became independent. It triumphed. And I was part of a circle of Marxist students, and they were, it was seen as the triumph of class, triumph of the liberation struggle against the class and capitalism and everything, and it was always the talk was, of course, there's going to be equality for women, and that was it, but it was derived. It was class conflict was seen as the essence, and then racial class conflict. But the idea was once that's won, then women's equality will follow naturally, and everyone the liberation, the language that was so triumphalist, and the Western academics who were big supporters were trumpeting the same language you're using, but in the Mozambican case, this did not happen. And I have, I'll give you a quote at the very end of my paper on work on Mozambique by Arnfeld. She talked to Mozambican women, combatants, who in '88 told her, now men behave just as they did before the war. Nobody respects women. We are at the bottom and the men are sitting on top of us. That's how they feel the war's treated them. So it's very hard to figure out why something would work in one place and not in another.
I was very struck by what you said about the idea that part of the dreams for peace is the longing for normality.
Yeah.
And when you unpack that, it often includes dreams for returning to the patriarchal order and so on. And it certainly made me think about World War II, and you referenced that several times. Because it wasn't simply the duration concept, so that Rosie the Riveter was an exceptional and newsworthy figure precisely because everybody knew she wasn't going to exist after the war.
Right.
But there was also the sort of more positive discourse about making the world or making the nation fit to receive our heroes when they came home. Now, this might have been a little different in the Soviet Union, I don't know, but definitely among the Western allies. You know, this was part of that that discourse, the greatest generation, we have to make them comfortable. We have to make them happy, we have to reward them. And part of that obviously was returning to those norms, full-time wives, housewives. The baby boom is part of all that. So you not only had a precipitate retreat from the wartime developments, but you probably also had a retrogression even to the pre-war situation, because many people have pointed out that certainly in North America and Western Europe, gender norms were even more rigid in the late 40s and 50s than they had been in the 30s. So it was even a retrogression. But your other point is so important. Obviously those wartime experiences did not disappear, could not have disappeared. You said it was the daughters of those women who quietly went back, who led the movement of the 60s, but in many cases it was those women themselves, because the time gap is quite short. I mean, I'm a historian, so I can help it. But between 45 and 60, it is not a long period. And some of the women who emerged in the West as part of the feminist movement in the 60s were not especially young. So it's not necessarily the daughters. Somebody like Betty Friedan, I don't think she was very young when she published.
No, she wasn't.
Right. So these were women who lived through the war. So absolutely, there'll be a time lag, but it's difficult to conceive, except maybe in truly exceptional circumstances. It's difficult to conceive that wartime situations don't have their effect a little bit later, which is presumably a positive thought.
It's one of the things to remind us that, you know, because sometimes I know academics, we sit around saying, why do we spend all our time, you know, with books and dusty things, and what's the impact of books when we're not out changing the world and everything. But actually, in the early 60s, as a new mother, having married too young, and I got a hold of feminine mystique. I literally did not put it down till I finished it. I mean, I fed the baby, I did other things and kept reading the book, you know. That book transformed. I mean, because it held up it let me see what had happened. So it took the veil off the normalness of it.
Betty Friedan in the US and Sheila Rowbottom in the UK
in Britain.
had a similar transformative effect. And I think they were women of a generation who had been, if not adults, teenagers during World War II.
I was thinking how interesting it would be to use some of these ideas of imagining peace in urban violence situations here in Trinidad, and how women might imagine things might be different when all these thousands of killings that have been going on attempted to actually stop, and if they have any hope for gender equality in different ways of doing kinship and child rearing, particularly into child rights. Or because I don't think really they do want to go back to it being the same or to being open. They really have no time for support and for short measures. They do want total transformation. And this would seem to be one opportunity to start discussing that as the revenge killings have gone down so much in England. And the rest of the country is blowing up, but
Or the revenge killing just happened in different places.
yes, the culture has been exported. Colonies of limited culture, I shouldn't say limited culture, but of violence and at risk and higher death rates have been seeded all over the country. But, the revenge killings have done one third inside what were called the hotspots.
But I mean, a lot of this is, some of you who are graduate students will know the importance of looking at discourse, the way in which language is used. You know, because it's, for instance, the analysis of the Eritreans, you know, people were so puzzled by that because it was so visually obvious that there seemed to be no differentiation in the treatment between women and male soldiers. down to the last, what they wore, everything. And so it was very difficult for people to take that apart. And it was not until Bernal starts doing basically a critical analysis of the way in which the narrative about the soldiers removed gender from the narrative. And she looked at the way everything was soldiers, and you were not allowed to say female soldier or male soldier. That was not allowed. So it was by taking that critical look at the language. What does it mean when a word is not there? Does it mean that it's changed, or does it mean that it's been put outside the changes that are going on? See, it's a very, very powerful way of analyzing change and lack of change. And so the ability to take apart language, this discourse analysis that we're doing in gender is a very, very powerful tool. It's like the whole thing of learning to read policies against the grain. What's there? What's not there? The silences are just as important as the words that are there. The words that repeat are important. The words that are repeatedly not there are important.
Jane, thanks for your presentation. It's really interesting. Two things. You talked about, that there are women who are exceptions in the context of war, because for one reason or another they're allowed to cross gendered norms and spaces. But I wondered about the way, just in general, wartime is considered an exception, right? So that it almost compels, Professor Mann is saying maybe some cases are different, but states of exception compel at some point almost a return to the old order, and they're also a state of exception that is probably much more masculinist, even if women are allowed into hyper-masculinist spaces than peacetime may have been. Because even if women are allowed into the armies are functioning on, war, death, violence, killing, rape, and so on.
It's still
right?
Man's business for the main part.
Yeah, so I just wonder, about the way that war becomes a state of exception that allows a hyper-masculinism, to then have to be, almost compels it to have to be taken on in peacetime with multiple effects depending on whatever, what's on the ground, whether it's education or, urban numbers or, whatever, the state of agriculture or the state of the state. So that's the first thing I wanted to just ask. And then the second thing is just to ask, what happens to feminist movements in those moments that you're documenting? So the reference just now was to conflict, and then post-conflict social justice. But, to me, I guess I'm just wondering, well, okay, there were feminist movements prior to moments of civil war, let's say. Right?
There may or may not.
Let's say, but what happens to them in those movements? Like, are they, what is their space for critique? Do they suffer a death over that phase of war for one reason or another, such that in the post-war period, that those overt feminist discourses that may have been there, even if they were marginal, are not have to be rebuilt? So it's almost asking, what does war do to the feminist movements that were creating a space for the transformation of gender order prior?
That raised an interesting thought in my mind that actually, despite at the end of World War I, with all its terrible chaos and everything, and this women, the flapper age, which was more transgressive.
Yeah.
But actually, in 1919, 1920, you get the vote. So the suffragette movement, which goes way back to before the Civil War in the U.S., emerges as an effective push force. So.
But
So-
also after World War I, because so many men had died, there were so many women, so you had
Yeah.
women tennis, all the things that men were
Yeah.
doing, you had women gymnastics clubs, women dances, women's things.
Yeah.
So something happened to feminism in relation to war
Yeah.
that then created different conditions.
And if any of you, do any of you watch Downton Abbey?
Sure.
Yeah. Those of us who are hooked on it are waiting for January when it starts, you know. And, but I mean, Downton Abbey, one of its themes is the way in which World War I undermined the aristocratic order in very fundamental ways, and how difficult it was for the people who were used to being in charge of everything, and then having people just saying, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna follow your orders, I'm not gonna take your prescriptions about what's proper and improper very seriously.
But one of the great ironies was that the vast majority of the newly enfranchised women in Britain
Yeah,
voted Conservative.
yes,
Voted Conservative, which is one reason why the Labour Party leaders were very,
yeah,
not so much reluctant, but apprehensive
yeah,
about what the political effect of giving the vote to women.
right. So, I mean, these are, very interesting questions. I think we also have to realize this argument about whether war creates hypermasculinity. I initially, in my writings on the Zimbabwean war and masculinity, and I still think that in many ways war does narrow down the possible ways of being masculine. Because militarized masculinity becomes privileged as the ultimate form of masculinity. But at the same time, there's an interesting work by Ortega, writing particularly out of Latin America, Dietrich Ortega, and she argues that we have to remember that even though there was pressure to become super masculine military men, there also were very other ways of being masculine which were being experienced, that there were also ways in which when some men wound up having to care for children, or, cook and run and do all kinds of, the gender division of labor got messed up. So she's the one who's arguing that there's more change than we thought, that the notion that war is above all about establishing hyper-militarized masculinity. And that is, I think, a very powerful force that we have to take seriously. But she's saying there are also other stories. But then what she says is these get constrained by being created as exceptions. And they very quickly get disciplined into some kind of acceptable form after conflict is over. But she is contesting this kind of hyper-militarized masculine soldier who is like this, poster child for the kind of statues of the heroic men with their big guns and everything, ready to do battle. So I guess what she's saying is it's messier. It's messier during conflict, and maybe then this gets us back to this point that maybe out of those messiness comes a lot of different things. Maybe it affected the possibility of sexuality, people beginning to see their sexuality differently too. But there is an attempt to close this debate down after war, for the most part. But the exceptions are incredibly important, and probably a whole other paper that needs to be written is where were the exceptions? Where were the times when change that occurred during the war actually carried on and had a life in the post-conflict transformation? That would be another very important thing to think about.
I'm wondering about neocolonialism and the kind of the failures of the decolonization hasn't really happened in many of the spaces that you're talking about. And I think, and I guess I wonder about that, like how that contributes to the failures of true liberation and the failures of post-colonial governments to fully achieve a space of equality, because there are still all these other factors of economic, political, and social control through, particularly through globalization, structural adjustment policies, deep reliance, dependency capitalism on former colonial powers. I wonder how that works, or if that's a factor at all in your analysis, and maybe a way for us to think about the strategizing in a globalized world, or thinking about the why, and then what are the possibilities.
I think that's a very important and complicated question. You know, we're used to looking at patriarchy within a capitalist system. And there is a tendency too often, I think, to assume that capitalism creates patriarchy. But in actual fact, patriarchy has existed in a wide variety of different kinds of systems. And its pervasiveness across so many different, the socialist world, the Buddhism, all kinds of different ways of organizing society. There's still the gender divisions will still tend to resurface in ways that privilege masculine power. And not, there are exceptions, but they're few. And so I think that it's dangerous to assume that all we need to do is get rid of the trappings of the Western economic and political structures, which we see as very patriarchal. And then we will have a possibility for a different way of organizing the world. And that possibility certainly could exist, but we have to, we must never forget that any kind of hierarchies lead to a world where there are winners and losers in terms of access to the economic and political and social elements of power. And so even in a society that was completely not capitalist, you still would have struggles over access to power. I think, though, I do think that that post-colonial societies that could become more truly decolonized could possibly hold out the hope of pulling on old alternative stories of ways of living. One of my favorite books is Dept Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe. I read it in the early 2000s. And like he says, he has this interesting point. He says Indian capitalism looks on the surface like it's just Western capitalism being done by Indians. But he said then he looked at some of the ways in which issues of spirituality, meditation, breaks in the day, very different attitudes towards being capitalist. And like the Tata Corporation, which is a big, huge, very successful corporation, at its head, it is centered around a social justice institution that uses funds, profits, first to fund good causes, and then hands out some back to the different. It's a completely different model than the Western industrial capitalism. So you could possibly posit that you could draw from models like that to try and think about the possibility of different ways of doing things. At the same time, the Hindu culture in particular is extraordinarily male-dominated and patriarchal. So I don't know, but we mustn't be romantic about this, but the world is in a period of enormous change, I think. No one in their right mind is depending on Europe for anything right now. I mean, maybe Germany, but the rest of Europe, in Spain, there's 40% unemployment in young men under 30. So the world is changing, and who knows where it's going to lead. The question is whether the gender power balances will shift in this changing world, and I hope they will, but I don't think there's any guarantee that a particular different form, you say, okay, we don't do capitalism, we'll do something else, that isn't necessarily going to solve it. Does that answer useful?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't suggesting that it was necessarily only about capitalism, but I see what you're saying.
I think it's just when we talk about neocolonialism, we tend to really talk about reading all the bad things off the capitalist system, you know, and that's the easy way. It doesn't have to be that way. I think the decolonial scholarship is very important.
Thank you for the presentation. In talking about imagined peace, you mentioned while in the conflict, soldiers would, or the female soldiers, male soldiers would think about what they would long for peace, and they would think about what it was like before the conflict began. And I'm wondering if that's the only way they're conceptualizing their peace, or are there discourses of freedom and peace developing within the conflict in a change kind of, and how would that factor in? Whether those discourses fell apart at the end of the conflict, or if that is the seed that then 15 years later kind of reemerges. So
yeah, I think that's, though definitely that's what's happening, is some people are really beginning to imagine a different future. But then what you see in the post-conflict transformation is a lot of work, a lot of efforts to damp that down.
right.
But as you know, Bridget has really helped us to see in these that we need to recognize that just because something gets damped down doesn't mean that it disappears. Maybe that's the thing about decolonialism as well, is we can talk about the need to look back into the past, into various pasts, and find strengths or find things that will lead to different ways of doing it. Yeah.
I like the notion of imaginative peace, but I think that the discussion about imaginative peace has to take place in the context of who is doing the imagining.
Right.
And it's not always the local conflictual parties that are doing the imagining.
Right.
A lot of it's coming from both sides as well. And you know, you mentioned DDR. DDR really is the whole DDR process, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration process. Actually, most of it develops outside of the conflict and the UN system.
Yeah.
She said that.
And But what I'm saying is that that changes the way in which you look at the imagined peace, because a lot of it's coming from outside. And two people came to mind when you mentioned that. And that's Susan McKay, whose work on Where Are the Girls? Question mark. It was very significant, I think, during the time of the Sierra Leone Liberia conflict.
Right.
And then the other person is Charlie Carpenter.
I know both of them.
And Charlie Carpenter's work is very useful in trying to understand what happens at the end of the conflicts and post-conflict situation, where you're trying to reintegrate women, especially, back into society.
Yeah.
And she points out, women who were raped and as a result, babies came as a result of those rapes, sometimes were not accepted back into communities at all. Because the babies were considered to be devil babies and the products of the people who committed the atrocities. So therefore, many of them end up being orphans, more or less in quotation marks, because they're not being accepted by the mother or the father and the community.
Right.
And that poses a serious problem for women who are trying to reintegrate back into the community. So I'm not sure if your work covers any of that.
It's just a chapter in a book, so I have to constrain myself. What I'm arguing is that there's been a lot of work on the external forces. Like there's a lot of literature on the peacekeepers, the international peacekeepers, and their attitudes and their behavior. A lot of talk about the various the external forces, but we haven't had much talk about internal forces. So what I'm saying is that we have to look also at the internal forces, and these DDR programs are dreamed up by people who naively, for the most part, thought that the women could just go home and they'd be accepted. Whereas if they'd actually looked at what was happening on the ground, they would have found that these women were by and large not being accepted. And you see it over and over and over, and you can understand people, people have gone away and you haven't seen them or heard from them, and you have no idea what they were doing, and you're told to just accept them. You don't know what kind of person you're dealing with, and then you have young children you're trying to wind up protecting from these girls, because they may have done terrible things and bring bad ideas. So the angle of my chapter is that the local gendered practices have not received enough attention. Ultimately, one needs to bring them together, obviously. But just for the chapter, I had to focus on what I was trying to argue, which is that these actually are very important and need to be taken just as seriously as the peacekeepers and the international institutions.
I was just thinking what you were just saying about accepting the women back into society after being female soldiers. But it was interesting that the women aren't allowed to be masculine anymore. But thinking about the male soldiers, the alternative is military. They're only allowed to be masculine. So there's obviously huge problems with decommissioned soldiers with post-traumatic stress. And they're not kind of allowed to actually be anything but masculine. So they also find it difficult to get back into society as well, but for the same kind of gender orders issues.
That's a really, really good point. Yeah. It's funny that, in a way, we're thinking about women being disciplined into becoming proper ladies, but it's true that the men are told you're supposed to look like a hero and act like a hero. If you're not a hero all the time, there's something wrong. And that's a terrible burden.
Jane, this was incredibly interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate having you here, and we also appreciate hearing about your new work. As always, you brought us many ideas for us to continue to consider, even in relation to our own research. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.